Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
It wasn't the fact that they went without me, it was that no one even thought I'd need to know. No heads up. No invite. Not even a passive-aggressive, "Oh, we figured you were busy." Just silence. Like I didn't exist. And I didn't find out through some dramatic revelation or text from my father or, God forbid, Candace. No. I found out because I stopped by my dad's house to drop off a charger he'd left at my apartment last week. I let myself in with the spare key he gave me back when he still remembered I was his daughter, and I walked into a completely dark, eerily quiet house. At first, I thought maybe they were out for dinner, but there were no dishes in the sink, no smells lingering in the air, nothing on the calendar in the kitchen, just a little note stuck on the fridge that said, "Trash pickup on Thursday. Don't forget." Candace's handwriting. Sharp and round and performatively neat. The next morning, I got my answer in a way that stung more than I expected. Blake, her precious son, the golden retriever in human form, posted a sun-drenched photo from Maui. Shirtless on a beach, frozen drink in hand, captioned, "Family time done right, palm tree, #blessed." That one word hit like a punch. Family. I wasn't in the photo. I wasn't on the beach. Hell, I wasn't even in the group chat. And, just when I thought it couldn't twist the knife any deeper, I saw it, his boarding pass peeking out from the corner of his tray table in another picture, snapped mid-flight. First class. Seat 3A. My father used to always book that seat for me when I'd fly out to see him in college, back before he married Candace, back when things weren't perfect, but at least they were honest. At first, I didn't react. I didn't call. I didn't text. I just stared at the pictures like someone who stumbled upon a stranger's vacation album. I felt hollow, not angry. Not yet. But that hollow feeling, the one that sits right under your ribcage and makes your hands shake a little when you reach for your coffee, that one turned into something else by the end of the day. I started replaying moments in my head. Candace telling me a few weeks ago, we might be doing something small over the summer, nothing big. Her casual mention that Blake had a job interview and might be staying close to home. My father vaguely saying, "We'll catch up soon." All of it carefully crafted, sewn into a soft little net to catch me from ever noticing the truth until it was too late to fall apart over it. So, I didn't fall apart. I cleaned my apartment. I finished a book I'd been putting off. I went to work. I smiled at people I don't care about. And 3 days later, on a quiet Thursday evening when the sky had just turned gold with sunset and I was heating up leftover stir-fry, there was a knock at my door. I didn't expect anyone. I almost didn't answer. But something in my stomach, maybe instinct, maybe pure curiosity, made me put down the chopsticks and walk to the door. Candace stood there, dressed like a fucking J.Crew catalog, perfectly casual, perfectly polished, her hair swept into a lazy bun that took effort to look that effortless. And in her hands, a round silver tin, tied with a ribbon. The kind you buy at a home goods store for showy cookie deliveries. She smiled like we were old friends who just had a silly little misunderstanding. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, her voice that soft, rehearsed tone that always made me feel like I was about to be talked down to. "I thought I'd stop by. We brought you something." I didn't say a word. Just opened the door wider and stepped aside. She walked in like she owned the place, which, honestly, wouldn't be far off if you looked at how she operated inside my father's life, and placed the tin on the table. "We missed you in Maui," she said as she turned to face me. No eye contact, just that fake concern stitched across her brows. It was so last minute. Blake got this crazy deal on airfare, and there were only 3 tickets available. You know how hard it is to coordinate schedules. I raised an eyebrow. 3 tickets, huh? You, Dad, and Blake. She nodded, like it made perfect sense. Exactly. And Blake, bless him, offered to give up the first-class seat, but your father insisted. Said he deserved a little comfort. I let the silence hang for a second too long. I wanted her to feel it. That invisible tension that happens when someone's lying to your face and they know you know. But I didn't give her the satisfaction of reacting. Instead, I looked down at the tin and said, "Cookies." She brightened, like we were finally getting to the good part. "Yes, I made them myself. Your favorite, chocolate chip with a hint of sea salt." I thought it might be a nice, Peace offering. I opened the tin. The smell was sweet, warm, nostalgic in a way that made me feel like I was 8 years old again, waiting for Mom to take the tray out of the oven. But these weren't my mother's cookies. And this wasn't some wholesome memory. This was Candace, showing up at my door with guilt disguised as sugar. I picked one up slowly, turned it over in my hand. It looked perfect. Too perfect. No crumbles. No cracks. I took a bite. It was good. Of course it was. Candace was good at looking good. She smiled wider, relief washing over her expression like I had just absolved her of every sin. See? Still warm. I nodded. Still warm, I echoed. Then I looked up, right into her eyes, and added, just like Blake. I'm guessing he brought back a tan. She flinched. Just slightly. A twitch in the corner of her mouth. He's very fair-skinned. Burns easily. I smirked. Right. Candace glanced at her phone. Well, I should go. Just wanted to say hello. No hard feelings, okay? I walked her to the door. She waved once, casually, like we'd just shared a pleasant evening tea. But as she turned away, I said something I knew she'd hear even as she pretended she didn't. You always did like faking for the people you're trying to keep quiet. She paused. Just half a second. Then kept walking. And I stood there in the doorway, tins still open on my kitchen table, one cookie missing. The next day, Blake showed up unannounced to grab his charger, like nothing ever happened. I offered him a cookie. The one with the strange aftertaste. There's a particular kind of sweetness that lingers when something isn't quite right, and the moment Blake took that cookie from the tin and popped it into his mouth with all the entitled confidence of someone who'd never been told no a single day in his life, I felt it, that quiet, unmistakable chill crawling just under my skin, the same one I used to get when I'd see Candace standing too close behind my father, whispering in his ear with her hand on his shoulder, her eyes flicking toward me. Like I was something that needed to be managed, not included. Blake didn't hesitate. He didn't look. He didn't ask. He just took. Like he always had. Like the world belonged to him by default and the rest of us were just visitors in his curated little kingdom of first-class flights, hand-carved surfboards, and birthday gifts that cost more than my rent. He was rambling about some new tech startup internship he landed through one of Candace's networking events, which probably meant some overpriced wine tasting full of wealthy divorcees and their freeloading sons. I barely listened. He talked like his thoughts were too important to hold in, like silence was beneath him. And while he talked, he chewed. Loudly. Obliviously. That part made me oddly calm. He reached for a second cookie before he even finished the first, and that's when I noticed it again, that one slightly off cookie. The texture was just a bit different. The chocolate chips hadn't melted the same way. It had a faint, powdery residue along the edge, like maybe something had been sprinkled on it after it came out of the oven, not mixed in like the rest. I remembered it from the night before. I'd looked at it, turned it over, smelled it. Something about it had made me pause, and even then, I couldn't quite explain why. I didn't stop him. I didn't say a word. I just watched. And that's the moment things shifted. He coughed. Once. Then again. Then he stopped mid-sentence, some story about a girl he met on the plane, I think, and blinked a few times like the air in the room had suddenly thickened. His hand went to his throat. A slow, dragging movement, not panicked yet, but confused. He coughed again, harder this time, and then leaned forward a bit, resting both hands on the counter like the room had started to tilt under his feet. I watched him closely. I didn't move. I didn't speak. And I certainly didn't offer water. Are these gluten-free? He finally choked out, like the thought had just occurred to him, even though he didn't have a damn gluten allergy and everyone knew it. I tilted my head, feigning curiosity, and said, "Why would they be?" He coughed again, this time sharper, throatier, like something was lodged in there. For a moment, I thought he was going to vomit, but he steadied himself. His face had gone a little pale, sweat prickling at his hairline, and there was a sheen across his forehead that hadn't been there before. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. He stood up straighter, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and muttered something about probably just too much sugar, brushing it off like his body hadn't just given him a polite little warning. And in typical Blake fashion, he laughed. Actually laughed. Said something about how Mom always overdoes it with the vanilla. I smiled politely, nodded, and handed him the charger. He left a minute later, still chuckling, still clueless. And I stood in the doorway long after he was gone, staring at the now half-empty tin on my kitchen counter. The smell of baked chocolate and salted butter hung in the air like a memory I didn't ask for, and I realized in that moment that Candace hadn't just baked those cookies. She had planned them. She had shaped them like an offering and tied them with a ribbon and carried them into my home with that same serene expression she wore the day she convinced my father to skip my college graduation because it was too stressful for him to travel. Over the years, it had all added up, like tiny cuts that you don't notice until you're bleeding. The last-minute, accidental cancellations. The holidays spent with just the immediate family. The time she changed the locks on the lake house and told me, after the fact, that it had been sold. My father never questioned it. He always shrugged and said something passive like, well, Candace handles that stuff, as if that excused the growing list of things I was quietly erased from. She had patience. That was her weapon. She didn't strike quickly. She preferred erosion slow, polite, and irreversible. So I sat down that night and made a list. Not on paper, just in my head. All the times she'd smiled while cutting me out. All the moments she'd manufactured to make me feel unstable, overly sensitive, reactionary. I remembered the time she told my father I seemed emotionally fragile after Mom died, even though I was the one organizing the funeral, calling relatives, cleaning out the house. Candace didn't lift a finger, but she managed to imply I was too distracted by grief to be trusted with financial decisions. That's when it clicked. This wasn't just a cookie. This was a message. And if I hadn't noticed that one strange cookie, the one with the dusting that didn't belong, the aftertaste that lingered too long on the tongue, if I had eaten it instead of handing it to her precious boy, I would have been the one clutching the counter. I would have been the one gasping for air, not knowing why my body was betraying me. And she would have been right there, with that same concerned voice, saying, Melissa, are you okay? While pretending she didn't know exactly what was happening. It wasn't enough to poison me. No, that would have been too obvious, too messy. But knocking me off balance, making me sick just enough for a hospital visit or a panic attack, enough for my father to finally say, maybe Candace is right, maybe Melissa's not well, that would have done the trick. So I did the only thing that made sense. I called someone I hadn't spoken to in almost 5 years. His name was Carter. He used to work in a toxicology lab, back when we were still sleeping together on and off after college. We didn't end well. He hated my silence. Said I never let people in. But he owed me. And more importantly, he still respected the version of me that paid attention. He picked up on the second ring. I asked him one question. Can you run a food sample for me? Discreetly. He said yes without asking why. I scraped the last 2 cookies into a plastic bag, sealed it tight, and marked it with a Sharpie. Then I sat down at the kitchen table, stared at the empty tin, and waited. Not just for results, but for the moment Candace would realize that maybe this time, her little game wasn't going to play out the way she planned. It didn't take long, less than 24 hours, in fact, before I got the call I hadn't been expecting so soon. Not from Carter. Not from the lab. But from her. And not a polite voicemail or a saccharine text dripping with emoji-laced apologies either, but a full-on, in-the-flesh ambush at my front door, exactly like the last time, only this time with none of the fake casualness, none of the homemade charm. There was no silver tin in her hands now, no warm cookies wrapped in performance. There was only Candace, standing stiff as a board on my front step, arms crossed tightly under her chest, her jaw set so hard it looked like she was biting down on her own tongue, and for once, just this once, she didn't bother pretending. I didn't even have to say a word when I opened the door. I just stood there, holding the edge of it like it was a barrier, a shield, something to remind us both that she was outside and I was in, and for the first time in what felt like years, that separation actually meant something. She didn't ask to come in. She didn't smile. She just stared at me with eyes that, despite being carefully composed, had lost that rehearsed warmth and flickered now with something colder, something closer to recognition. "He told me," she said, and her voice didn't shake, but it had a rough edge to it, like sandpaper over satin. "He told me what happened after he ate the cookie." I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I didn't invite her to elaborate. I simply leaned slightly against the door frame, arms crossed, mirroring her without meaning to, letting silence fill the space like smoke. She took a small step closer, just enough to break that thin line of safety between conversation and confrontation, and asked me, in a voice just above a whisper, "You didn't eat that one, did you?" Now, there are moments in life when a person's entire truth is exposed, not by what they confess, but by what they ask. And that question, simple as it seemed, wasn't really a question at all. It was a tell. It was an admission. It was a full-volume confession dressed in a quiet murmur. I let the question hang in the air for a few seconds too long, long enough for her to feel the weight of her own words, and then I tilted my head just slightly, as if genuinely confused, and replied, "Why? Should I not have?" That did it. Her lips pressed together so tightly they turned white, and her eyes darted, just for a split second, to the space behind me, like she was considering whether she should force her way inside or whether she still had the upper hand. And for the first time since she married my father and became the unofficial gatekeeper of everything he used to hold sacred, I saw it, real panic. Not fear of being caught. Fear of losing control. She shook her head slowly, more to herself than to me, and said, "I didn't mean for Blake to," but she stopped short, caught herself, inhaled sharply through her nose, and started again. "I think we need to talk." "Then talk," I said, still not moving. But she didn't. Not right away. Because the truth was, she hadn't come to talk. She'd come to manage. To contain. To test whether the fire she tried to light had spread to the curtains yet, or whether she could still stomp it out with a polished heel and a perfectly controlled apology. But I wasn't going to give her that. So instead, I let her squirm. "You know," I said slowly, carefully, as if I were still making up my mind about whether I was the victim or the villain in this story, "it's strange. I thought those cookies tasted off. One of them in particular. Too salty. Not quite right." Her jaw twitched. I stepped forward slightly, shrinking the space between us, and added, "Blake didn't like it either. He said it made his throat itchy. Weird, right?" She didn't respond. She couldn't. And then, in a tone so even it bordered on bored, I asked, "What did you put in them?" Her mouth opened, then closed again. She looked like a fish pulled out of water, gasping for a version of the story that would let her swim back into control. "I didn't," she started, then stopped, exhaled, and gave me a look that should have come with a subtitle. "Don't push this." But I didn't have to, because I already had. She turned to leave without another word, but just as she stepped off the porch, she turned back and said, "This isn't the kind of thing you want to turn into a family issue, Melissa. Your father, he doesn't need that kind of stress." And there it was, the gentle threat, dressed up as concern. That final, desperate swing. I smiled, not kindly. "You're right," I said. "Let's not bother him. Wouldn't want to ruin any more vacations." That night, I stayed up late, pacing my living room in long, quiet circles, replaying every syllable of her visit, every micro-expression she failed to hide. And when my phone finally lit up with Carter's name, I answered immediately, already knowing what he was going to say before he even said it. "There's something in those cookies," he said, his voice low, cautious, like he wasn't quite sure how to tell me. "It's trace, but it's there. Lisinopril." The name meant nothing to most people, but I recognized it instantly, an ACE inhibitor, used for blood pressure, mostly harmless on its own but known to cause dizziness, fainting, and severe side effects when combined with other medications. Like the one I've been taking for anxiety since my mom passed. The one that, when mixed with lisinopril, could drop my blood pressure fast enough to make it look like an episode. Or a breakdown. Or worse. I thanked Carter, hung up, and stared at the wall for what felt like a full hour. She hadn't tried to kill me. No, She tried to unmake me, to turn me into the unstable stepdaughter, the one who overreacts, the one who needs help, the one who could be sidelined without guilt, without confrontation, without consequence. And if I had eaten the wrong cookie, just one full dose, just enough to make me collapse in front of my father or Blake or anyone who still thought I had a sliver of credibility, she could have finished the job with nothing more than a worried phone call and a sigh. Melissa's not doing well again. It's so sad. But she made a mistake. She gave me the chance to bite first and pass it on. And now? Now I had more than a theory. I had motive. I had substance. But I wasn't going to the police. Not yet. I was going to set the table. I was going to make dinner. And she was going to be invited. There's something profoundly unsettling about knowing someone tried to hurt you in a way that would leave no bruises, no blood, and no screaming scene for the neighbors to eavesdrop on, but instead chose a method so quiet, so surgically precise, that you'd likely thank them for it on your way down. That was the sensation I couldn't shake the night I received the results from Carter, a simple email, subject line clinical and indifferent, nothing dramatic, just, sample analysis complete. I opened it like I already knew what it would say, because somewhere deep inside the pit of my stomach, I did. The message was short, factual, like Carter knew anything else would dilute the gravity of what he'd found. The cookies contained trace levels of lisinopril, just enough to cause a significant drop in blood pressure if consumed in a sufficient amount, and particularly dangerous when interacting with medications like the one I was prescribed daily, without fail, since I'd started having panic attacks after my mother's funeral. I stared at those words for a long time, watching them blur into the light of my screen, not because I didn't understand what they meant, but because I did, and because now I had a choice. With that report, I could have walked into a police station, printed copy in hand, and tried to explain to some exhausted officer behind plexiglass that my stepmother had attempted to drug me with a cookie under the guise of reconciliation. But here's the truth, it wouldn't have worked. Not really. Not without a smoking gun. Not without me having actually swallowed the evidence and collapsed dramatically at the dinner table while Candace dialed 911 and shook her head with practiced dismay. A few crumbs in a baggie and an ex-boyfriend's analysis weren't going to deliver justice. No, it wouldn't have been justice. It would have been a dismissal. A shrug. Another little tally mark in Candace's emotionally unstable stepdaughter narrative, which I was beginning to see had been carefully curated over the last decade like a slow-boiling conspiracy. Because this wasn't the first time she'd tried to rewrite the story. I started tracing it back, the small things, the barely noticeable shifts in how people treated me when she was around, the tiny seeds of doubt she planted with surgical precision. There was the time she offered to help manage my mother's estate and accidentally forgot to send me one of the financial documents, which resulted in a missed deadline and a minor legal headache that my father later attributed to me being distracted. There was the Christmas she pulled me aside and asked if I'd been drinking more than usual, citing concern after I poured a second glass of wine with dinner, while Blake was on his third cocktail in the same room. There was the brunch I wasn't invited to because it was just for the girls, which somehow didn't include me but did include 3 of her tennis friends and the woman who used to cut my hair. It all made sense now. She'd been building something, not just a narrative, but a safety net for herself, a structure of plausible deniability so complete that, even if I had collapsed from that cookie, she would have walked away with clean hands and a sad smile. That was the real horror, not that she had tried to drug me, but that she had done it with such elegance, such confidence, knowing I'd have no one in my corner who wouldn't first ask, "Are you sure this isn't a misunderstanding?" I knew then what I had to do. I deleted the email. Not because I wanted to let it go. Not because I was afraid. But because Candace didn't deserve a courtroom. She didn't deserve a headline. She deserved something much worse. She deserved to be seen, finally, without the mask. And not by strangers or cops or lawyers, but by her own people. By the ones who believed in her version of me. By my father. By Blake. She deserved to be caught not with a lab report, but by her own undoing. So I started preparing, not just emotionally, but literally. I planned a dinner. A simple family dinner, nothing extravagant, something she couldn't say no to without raising suspicion. I called my father first and told him I'd love to have them over, just a low-key night, just the four of us. His voice brightened with the kind of relief that only comes from a man who thinks the women in his life are finally getting along, and he accepted before I could even finish the sentence. He told me Candace would be thrilled. I bet she was. She probably assumed I'd given up, that the silence meant surrender, that I was moving on with that cookie-shaped dagger still lodged in my back. When I called Blake, I made sure to sound casual, even warm, throwing in a joke about not poisoning the food this time, to which he laughed and replied something asinine about cookies being a dangerous game. He didn't suspect a thing. Of course he didn't. He was his mother's son, arrogant in that effortless, unearned way that made him immune to scrutiny. He said he'd be there, hungry as hell. And so, over the course of the next few days, I prepared the menu. I cleaned the apartment from top to bottom, not because they'd notice, but because I needed the space to feel like mine again, like a place of power. I went to the store, bought ingredients I didn't need, burned a candle I hadn't touched in years, and placed the now-empty cookie tin in the trash with slow deliberation. That part was important, symbolic, maybe, but necessary. The cookie phase was over. The next chapter wouldn't be served warm. It would be served cold, calculated, and with a side of polite revenge. I even practiced what I'd say if the moment presented itself, not a speech, not a confrontation, but a single sentence, something simple that would stick like a thorn. Something I could toss casually across the table, laced with ambiguity, wrapped in calm. Because the truth was, I didn't want Candace to scream. I didn't want her to confess or cry or even apologize. I wanted her to wonder, to squirm, to second-guess every moment of the evening, every word I said, every bite she took. I wanted her to know, deep in her marrow, that I knew, and that I had chosen not to expose her, but to reflect her. That was the brilliance of the plan. It wasn't about poisoning her back. That would have been easy, stupid, even. It was about showing her what it felt like to be watched, to eat something offered with a smile and wonder, just for a moment, if it came with a price. I wouldn't need medication. I wouldn't need lies. I'd use her own weapon against her, hospitality. The night before the dinner, I stood in my kitchen, staring at the glowing stovetop, lasagna baking slowly, garlic bread warming in foil, dessert chilling in the fridge. And I thought about how small she had tried to make me, how quietly she had tried to erase me from the family narrative, how precisely she had aimed to control the perception of me, unstable, unpredictable, forgettable. But I wasn't any of those things. I was patient. I was watching. And I was about to become unforgettable. The strange thing about revenge, especially the kind that simmers quietly beneath the surface for long stretches of time, is that when the moment finally arrives, when the conditions align, the stage is set, and the curtain slowly begins to rise. What you feel isn't adrenaline, or anger, or even triumph, but an eerie sort of calm, a stillness so profound that it almost feels like a betrayal of what you've imagined. You expect fire and fury, maybe even chaos, but instead, you find precision, silence, and an almost disconcerting clarity that cuts sharper than any knife could. That was exactly the state I found myself in on the night my family, if we can still call them that, came to my home for what they believed would be a simple, well-meaning dinner meant to mend old wounds, re-establish civility, and smooth over the rough edges that Candace and I had spent years carefully sharpening behind each other's backs. The lasagna was already in the oven when they arrived, bubbling gently under a thick blanket of mozzarella and ricotta, and the table had been set with a meticulous attention to symmetry I hadn't practiced since my mother was alive, and every detail of a family meal still meant something. The napkins were folded, not just placed. The wine glasses sparkled, and the overhead light, dimmed just enough to cast long, warm shadows, gave the entire space the illusion of comfort, of peace. I wore a soft sweater in muted green, the color my father used to say made my eyes look serious, and a simple necklace Mom had given me when I turned 21, a detail Candace would surely notice, and one I wore for that very reason. They entered as expected, Richard with his awkward, slightly hunched posture, the look of a man who had long since learned that quiet compliance makes for easier holidays. Blake with his usual swagger, eyes flicking around the apartment like he was scanning for anything beneath his station, and Candace, of course, with that signature half-smile and a bottle of wine clutched in both hands like an offering she could write off as generous, even though I had specifically said, "I'll handle everything, just bring yourselves." She had brought herself, all right, wrapped in cashmere, perfumed in something subtle and expensive, and armed with her favorite weapon, charm disguised as grace. Dinner went smoothly, almost too smoothly, as though everyone sensed a fragile thread running under the surface of the conversation and instinctively knew not to pull it. My father complimented the lasagna, twice, which told me he was nervous, and Blake made some offhand joke about the cookie incident, laughing as if it were nothing more than a quirky little misunderstanding. The kind that becomes a family anecdote repeated during Thanksgivings when everyone's had one too many glasses of Pinot. Candace didn't laugh. Not right away. She paused, ever so slightly, to study my face, probably hoping to catch a twitch of guilt or a sign that I still didn't know everything. I gave her nothing. I nodded along, smiled softly, and poured more wine. It wasn't until dessert that the atmosphere shifted. I brought out a small tray of cookies, not the kind from the tin, of course, but something more refined, crisp-edged shortbread with a dusting of lavender sugar. The kind of thing that looks innocent and impossibly delicate, but carries the weight of a message when delivered by someone who has never, not once in a decade, offered you dessert. Candace noticed immediately. Her hand hovered over the tray for a moment too long, her eyes starting briefly to mine before she selected one and held it like a fragile piece of evidence. Blake, true to form, grabbed two at once, biting into the first with that same blind enthusiasm that had gotten him into this mess in the first place. He chewed quickly, made a small sound of satisfaction, and reached for his wine. And then, as if the universe itself had been waiting for this very moment, Blake coughed. It wasn't dramatic, not this time. Just a small, sudden hiccup in the smooth rhythm of the evening. But it was enough. Enough to make Candace freeze, her hand still holding her untouched cookie, and slowly turn her head toward me with that look again, that look I'd seen when she first asked, "You didn't eat that one, did you?" But this time, there was no calculation, no soft tone. Just pure, unfiltered suspicion. "What's in these?" she asked, voice low, tight, with an edge she didn't bother to hide. I didn't answer right away. I waited until Blake coughed again, this time a little harder, this time with a look of vague confusion on his face, and then I sat back, picked up my book from the side table, opened it to a page I'd marked, and said, without looking up, "I used your recipe." There was a silence so complete that for a moment I could hear the faint tick of the clock in the hallway, each second stretched out like a thread pulled taut across a canyon. My father shifted in his seat, blinking as though trying to make sense of what had just been said, while Candace sat perfectly still, her face a mask of horror and calculation, trying to decipher whether she was being accused or confessed to, or perhaps both. Blake, now red in the cheeks and clearly struggling to swallow, pushed his plate away and mumbled something about needing water. I didn't move to help him. Neither did Candace. "Melissa," she said slowly, deliberately, "what are you trying to do?" I turned the page of my book. "What you did," I replied. And then I looked up, calmly, not angrily, not emotionally, but with a steadiness that made even Blake stop fidgeting. "Do you feel that?" I asked. "That thing in your chest right now?" The question you're afraid to say out loud. I smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile that only comes when you realize you've taken back something that was stolen from you. That's how I felt when I bit into your cookie. Candace stood then abruptly, the chair legs scraping harshly against the floor, but she didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Her silence was louder than any denial could have been. She grabbed her purse with a hand that trembled just enough for me to notice, and she walked to the door without a single backward glance. My father followed, quietly, the way he always had, and Blake stumbled behind them, still coughing, still looking at me like I had become a stranger. And maybe I had. Maybe that was the point. Because in that moment, sitting at my own table, surrounded by the smell of garlic and sugar and bitter realization, I wasn't their Melissa anymore. I wasn't the daughter who tolerated being forgotten, the woman who swallowed subtle cruelty with a smile, or the girl who kept trying to earn a seat at a table that had long since decided she didn't belong. I was something else now. And whether they left thinking I had poisoned those cookies or simply served them a slice of their own medicine didn't matter. Because the truth would haunt them far longer than any confession. I didn't follow them out. I didn't explain. I didn't clean up. I just picked up my book. And I read.